Hi, this is Juliana. In this series of escrow basics, I previously described what an escrow is. I advised you what we need to open an escrow, and I summarized what actually occurs when you open the escrow transaction. But invariably, something happens, and then this is where people will say they fell into this deep, dark escrow hole. So, today, I am going to take a look at some of the pitfalls that we need to avoid when we open the escrow. What are some of the things that happen that the buyer can avoid? First of all, the buyer's names are incorrect and we don't find out until they sign the loan docs. They've had our paperwork since the beginning, but they don't let us know until the very end that their names were typed incorrectly or there was a middle initial missed or something like that. Number two, the opening or the closing funds from the buyer came out of an account that the lender does not know about. So when the buyer is getting a loan, they are going to do a loan application with the lender. On the loan application, it will state what are their accounts, where is their money coming from, and so forth. Now be sure that the money comes from these accounts and not from another one that you did not disclose to the lender. Number three, switching these lenders halfway through the transaction or 2/3 of the way through the transaction. That means you're starting all over again. Don't do that. Number four, the buyer's income changed. He's now on commission. Yay! But, it's very tough to change this lender's focus on the underwriting when you change from one type of income to another type of income. Another thing is when you have a problem on your income tax returns. Let's say that you did not file it for this year and you need it in order to get your loan to qualify. Or you can't find your income tax for the past years, or you can't even find your W-2. That has been known to happen. The buyer is self-employed and they cannot document their income. Well, being self-employed, you need to be able to be sure that you have all this information together and submit it to the lender way in advance so that if there's anything that they need, they can tell you beforehand and not affect your loan. If the buyer filed a bankruptcy not too long ago, this can affect. The best thing for the buyer to do is to ask their lender, give them their financial background and let them know if there was a bankruptcy. The lender is going to be able to tell you if they can get your loan approved that way. The buyer changed jobs or they got laid off in a transaction. This happens sometimes. Sometimes they find a better job. And that means that the lender has to go back and they have to get all the verification of employments done again. Of course, if you got laid off, then that's another problem of itself. What about when the buyer's final funds are not readily available? For instance, they were in a stock, in stocks, and now they have to sell it to their stock broker. Sometimes it takes 7 business days to sell the stocks and get the money to fund the transaction. So these are things that the buyer needs to know in advance so that it doesn't become a pitfall. The lender not getting final verification of the employment. They will need to call the HR department or the person who is in charge of getting the verification of employment before they will fund the loan. So if this person happens to go on vacation, that's been known to happen, they go on vacation or they left their office, the lender can't verify the employment at the very end, the loan doesn't fund. What about if the buyer's final funds came from somebody else and they forgot to let the lender know? Oh my gosh. Well, if you do have gift funds that are coming from somebody else, please let the lender know in advance when they're checking your credit and your bank balances. And finally, there's always this headache, and that is that halfway through the transaction, the parties will negotiate a new sales price. And that means that this loan has to go through underwriting again. All the costs have to change. Everything has to be redisclosed, and the transaction is going to be delayed. So negotiating a sales price should come as early in the transaction as possible. Now, what can happen to the seller side that affects his ownership? First and foremost, we have had transactions in which the seller passed away, and there's no automatic successor to it, to the property. That means that the property has to go through probate, go through the court to determine who is going to have ownership of the property and continue the contract. What about when the seller has an old loan that was paid off, but there's no release and they can't find the lender? This happens a lot more than people realize. You pay off the loan years ago, you're very happy about that, but you never got a reconveyance or a release stating that you paid off. Now it is 10 years later, you're going to sell the property and you realize that this lender, most of the time it's a private lender, this lender is gone and you can't find it. What do you do? From time to time, we will have a seller who has gotten ownership of the property through transfers from different family or relatives or so forth. Past ownership that got transferred from one person to another without going through escrow or getting title insurance is a problem. And there will be things that the escrow holder is going to need from all these past owners in order to complete this transaction. Because when there's a past owner, if they have any debts that they had at the time against themselves, it will automatically attach to this property. So if it isn't paid off, if this debt is not paid off or resolved, then this seller is going to need to resolve it or pay for it. What about when the seller has their own liens and judgments and they did not know about it? This happens sometimes. A judgment is filed against the seller and he has no knowledge of it. So when the title preliminary report comes out and these things happen, the escrow is going to let the seller know, and this has to be worked on right away. What are some of the things that happen to the property and affects the closing? What if there's an unpaid HERO or PACE loan that needs to be paid off? What is a HERO or PACE loan? These are loans that are given so that the property can have energy efficient things added on. For instance, like solar panels. Well, sometimes the seller forgets because these HERO or the PACE loans could be attached to the property through their property taxes. So they forget to tell the buyer that, oh, I'm still paying for this loan. So is the seller going to pay off the loan and when the property is transferred to the buyer, or is the buyer going to take over this loan? And that, of course, adds to their debt. So this is a big question. What about when the property needs a lot of repair work and you find out of this from the inspection report that the buyer did? Or what about when the city inspection report shows that there's major work needed for code compliance? For instance, a bathroom that was put up without a permit, a patio covering or awning that needs to be taken down. These are all work that the buyer or the seller may not have been aware of, at the beginning, and it will affect the closing. What else? The property did not appraise to value. I mentioned in one of my previous videos that it would be great if the seller went ahead and when the appraiser comes to put the property nicely to make sure that everything looks good and so that the appraisal will come into value. When the appraiser does not come into value, this becomes a problem because the buyer can, one, have to put more money down, or two, they can go ahead and cancel the transaction. When the lender sees that there are repairs to be done, they may not let the buyer take care of the repairs. They may want the repairs to be done before the transaction is closed. So this is something that will hold up the closing also. The lender requires the repairs to be done. The seller has to shell out money in advance to get that work done. What if the property is in a fire hazard area and the insurance is hard to find? There are certain areas of the state of California which there's a fire hazard. So you cannot get regular insurance. You have to go through the government regulated insurance. So this is something that the buyer has to be made aware of. Sometimes when the preliminary report from the title company comes down and escrow company is reviewing it, you will see that there are some easements or some encroachments that affect the property. For instance, what is an encroachment? Let's say that there is a wall. The wall between a neighbor and you does not fall on the property line. It falls, let's say, on your property, or it falls on their property. Is this wall an encroachment? What do we do about the encroachment? So these are things that may affect the property and has to be dealt with before the closing. So other problems that can throw off the transaction, first of all, what if the escrow time period is too short for the qualification or the city inspection work? You go into escrow, you think 20-day escrow, I'm going to get this done in 20 days, but it's not enough time for the loan to qualify or for the city inspection to be done or for all the repairs to be done. So this escrow time period is very important, and when you negotiate it at the beginning, should be taken into account whether or not there's sufficient time to get all the work done or all the conditions done. What happens when the buyer or the seller's paperwork is sent in late and there's information on it that becomes an issue? So for instance, let's say that the buyer said that they were a single person, but he turns out to be married. That means that this spouse has to join in and qualify for the loan. Or maybe the seller says that he is not married and he actually is married. So these are things that will come out in the information forms that we require from the parties. And if they don't turn this in early enough, then we find out a little late. And once those issues come up, then we have to maybe extend the transaction. What if the buyer is selling another home? And that, of course, happens all the time. They're selling another home, and that money from that other home is going to come in to buy this one. However, there's a problem on that transaction. You can't close because that transaction is not ready to close. Or the same thing happens to the seller. The seller is purchasing another home, and that transaction is not ready to close. Or they're buying a home that is new, and the builder hasn't finished building it. That happens. So these are things that are pitfalls of the transaction. Possession of the property at the closing should be scheduled so that the parties have sufficient time to leave the property. The seller has sufficient time to leave the property so that the buyer can move in. We do not want to have the possession on this date and find out that the buyer is at the curb with the moving van, and the seller has not finished getting out of the property. So possession of the property is very, very important, and it can be a pitfall. This is one that escrow holders really get upset about. The seller and the buyer, our clients, go on vacation or they go out of the country without telling us, and they do not sign all the paperwork. So we are scrambling around trying to find these parties to sign the paperwork. I had a client who went to Mexico he went back to his town in Mexico without signing his grant deed. Well, the town that he was going to was like a 2-hour drive from the nearest capital. It didn't have very good reception, couldn't get through to him. And in order for him to sign this deed, he had to drive all the way through to the capital and find a notary. This is what happens when they don't tell us that they're going out of town or going out of the country and the paperwork doesn't get finished. What other thing can happen? This is the absolute truth. Earthquakes and fires. Anything that is a natural disaster. The Northridge earthquake, the Loma Prieto earthquake. We've had cancellations because of the earthquake. What about the fires that occurred in California? These are all natural hazards, natural disasters that will affect the transaction. And not only that, we know now that a pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, will also affect the actual closing of the transaction. Sad to say. Now, there are many other events that can happen, but talking about them means that you will be with me, listening to me through this day. So we're going to stop right now, and let me show you what I am wearing today on my t-shirt. Today, I am Groot from the Marvel Comics of Guardians of the Galaxy. This is a cutie pie. Today, I am Groot. Thank you very much. This is Juliana too. I appreciate your sitting in and listening. If there's any questions, please do feel free to contact me right here. Visit me on juliana2.com, and I will see you the next time. Thank you for listening.